second time. I call the member for Barara.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much. Can I just spend a moment or two, and it may help the member who is about to leave to hear some of this. I have been the subject of a great deal of comment for having some very strong views about the integrity of our border arrangements and the need for government to be assiduous in dealing with those issues. But often people don't understand the reasons why I have that strength of view on those matters. And they arise because for most of my time in public life, and as many know, it's 39 years that I've been in this chamber as a member of the House of Representatives, I have taken a great deal of personal interest in the plight of refugees. I have visited camps right round the world where I suspect few of my colleagues have ever been. I went to Trishkurtan, where I saw Eastern Europeans. I went to Hong Kong when the Vietnamese were fleeing. I went to Thailand to see the Cambodians who fled over the border. I went to Pakistan to see the Afghans who had fled. I went to the Balkans, where I saw the Croats and the Serbs and the Bosnians and so many others displaced. I went to Kosovo. Perhaps the greatest impact on me was going to Africa and to see some 90,000 people, and I think the numbers have risen beyond that since then, in a camp called Kakuma in northern Kenya. Congolese, the Sudanese, some Somali, Ethiopians. These weren't people who would ever meet a people smuggler. These weren't people who had money in their pockets to be able to pay to be trafficked to wherever they may prefer to be. These were people often who were in immediate risk, even though they had fled thinking they might be safe. I mean, it's always fascinated me when I know that there are 42 million people in the world who are displaced or refugees, at least 10 million of them assessed to be refugees, and in reality most of those people are never going to be able to find a place for resettlement in the way in which those who make it to Australia and engage our protection obligations have been able to. And you ask yourself, why is it that those who have got the money to pay to be trafficked should be given priority? What makes it so important that their needs, which are just the same as the other 10 million people's needs, assessed in exactly the same way, why are their needs greater? I tell you, in my more cynical moments, I suggest to the government they could deal with their budget issues. They could go to Kakuma and say, who's got $10,000? We'll give you a place. When I suggest that to people, they laugh. They say, oh, the government couldn't go and ask for money to determine who should get a place. Well, why should the places be determined? Because we are party to a refugee convention. Because people can engage a people smuggler who gets them to the front of the queue. And I've said that for years. And it justified, in my view, morally and appropriately, every decision I ever took as minister. We didn't need to be in a position where we have some 30,000 people knocking at our door. But there were some people on the other side of the chamber, not many of them here to hear it, who had a view that I was some dreadful ogre. The Howard government was unconscionable in the way in which it dealt with these issues. The measures that we implemented weren't needed. It wasn't a question of whether they'd work or not work. They weren't needed. They were morally reprehensible. We had a change of government, and one by one all of the measures that were in place and working were saving people's lives, preventing people getting on vessels, enabling us to resettle those people who needed help most, were stripped away. And when the government finds that having stripped away all those measures, they've got a problem, they don't want to adopt the measures that worked. They think we've got to find our own way forward. But progressively, they are picking up each of the measures. Now, I have a mischievous sense of humour in relation to these things. I sometimes say, look, I don't think there is any one magic bullet in the measures that we used. I don't think it's a menu that you can just go and pick and choose from and say, oh look, if we adopt this entree, that'll stop the boats. In my view, you need the full menu. I suppose if I was cynical, I'd say you have to make a meal of it. But this government is not prepared to do that. It's not prepared to adopt temporary protection visas. They may get a chance to think about that. Perfectly proper under the Refugee Convention. Refugee Convention makes it very clear our obligation is not to return people to situations of persecution. That's the obligation. It's not to give them permanent residency. It doesn't say anything about that. And so if you find that circumstances change and people can go home, why shouldn't that happen? And it has happened. We did it in relation to the Kosovars that we brought to Australia and settled here temporarily and supported them. And when circumstances were such that they could go home, that was the case. There have been times when Afghans have been able to go home. I suspect there are times when many others who seek to engage our protection obligations could in fact go home. I don't think in principle there is anything wrong with it, but the Labor Party isn't prepared to pick it up. Turning boats around. I mean, I think it's fascinating looking at the way in which they're dealing at the moment with some of the Sinhalese and Sri Lankans that are arriving here in Australia, where upon an initial inquiry they've got them on the first plane back that they can find. And yet they're super critical of those who say, well, look, if somebody's coming in on a boat and you can safely turn it round, why shouldn't you? Look, Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill that we are debating is about a measure in which the Labor Party said when we were in office should not be pursued. This is about, using the colloquial jargon, this is about excision of the whole of Australia from the migration zone. And some people laugh when you say you're going to exclude Australia from the migration zone. I mean, that's what this bill is about. This is about excision of the whole of Australia from the migration zone. This is the Labor Party in office introducing legislation to achieve this end when they vigorously opposed it before. I suspect it's not going to make very much difference. And one of the reasons is that they've made some other decisions about the consequences of what happens if you have not arrived in the migration zone. And they go to the way in which your claims are assessed and processed. And effectively, this government took decisions at an earlier point in time in which the consequences of having not arrived in the migration zone have been essentially diminished. Those who are going to be affected by this legislation can be transferred in and out of Australia, but it's not going to affect the way in which their claims are going to be processed. It's not going to affect the multi-tiered approach in relation to judicial review on top of initial decision-making. All of those matters which this government has been responsible for putting in place, which have compounded the problem and made it more difficult for us to get those people who are not refugees out of the system and returned home as quickly as possible. All of those measures that have ensured that we have something like 99% of those people who arrived by boat being found to be refugees, or at least contesting them, will in fact remain. This legislation, which the government believes is going to assist, will not deal with those fundamental questions, and they still remain unaddressed. We're dealing with a situation where only several hundred of those 30,000 people who have arrived have been able to be removed. There were the 500 or so Sri Lankans that have been able to be removed, but the message is still out there for the people smugglers. If we can get you to Australia, you will have a place in which you will be able to stay. I don't believe, even when the government says they're only going to give people bridging visas and they're not going to process them in any expeditious way, they'll leave them in limbo for 5 years, that will stop people working. I don't know what they'll do if they find that somebody on a bridging visa has been out there engaging in employment unlawfully. Are they going to say, oh look, you've breached your visa condition, we're going to terminate and we're going to return you home? No. They might say, we'll take you into detention, but I suspect they'll be saying, gee, I hope we don't find anybody because we've got no detention accommodation left. You know, this is a situation in which the Labor Party, who held out that they had consciences above everybody else, are now disclosing absolutely their hypocrisy in relation to these matters. And that needs to be clearly understood by the Australian people. They are adopting measures that they hope may enable this issue to be dealt with, but I suspect the half-hearted way in which they are proceeding with these matters will leave them with a continuing problem. I don't like it. I want to see Australia able to hold its head up high, helping those refugees who need help most, those people who languish in places like Kakuma and are in immediate risk and danger, and who are never going to be helped, because the places are being lost to those people who have the money to pay, to those people whom we are seeing day after day continue to turn up here because smugglers have led them to believe that they can get them to the front of the queue. And it is a queue. Part of the problem is it's a very long queue, but it is a queue. And the government ought to be able to go out there and hold their head up high and say, look, we're serious about dealing with these matters.
It's being 2 p.m. The debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 43. Are there any questions without notice?